Hello, welcome again. We are doing our lecture number 5. We're in New Testament. Okay, New Testament background. We're going to talk about that. We're going to hear the lecture of that, which I am not going to do, but a college professor will. Okay, he's a very good college professor. He's talking from this book. He's talking from this book. So if you have the money, get this book on Amazon or Walmart have it online. eBay have it. More money on eBay, but Walmart and Amazon have it. You could get it and follow along with me if you can. Okay, is the cradle, the cross, and the crown. Okay, good. And I want you to follow along. If you don't have it, at least you have the basic background, and you could go back to the to this page. Start from the introduction and keep on going up to where we at. You understand? And you could follow along with this book. This is my faithful cat, and we call him Tux. She's a girl. We call her Tux. My daughter found her a while back, and while driving almost ran over her, and she bring her into the church. So we kept her since it's COVID-19. We don't have the members inside the church for now, so we're not having no service. We kept her there, and when we start having regular Sunday service, we're gonna bring her back home. We're gonna bring her home, but so far she's very comfortable here, and she kept me company while she's here. Look at her playing on me as if I'm her mama or something. She's addicted to me. So don't pay her no mind. That's my baby right there. Anyway, get your paper, get your pen, and everything else ready for this lecture. You're gonna like it. Get your everything ready. If you have any questions, send me an email. My email is on this page, and my number is on this page. You could always call me for questions, and I'll gladly answer you. Okay, leave me a message just in case I don't call you at the time. I'll call you back. Okay, no problem. Guess let's get ready with the lecture. Okay.
This is lecture number 5, titled Background to the New Testament. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the cultural.
Also, if you don't see me talk to you at all during the lecture, don't mind me. I'm also doing the same work, so you understand.
Environment that is essential to understanding a lot of what took place both in the Gospels in that period of time and the life of Christ, as well as the apostolic period that covers the book of Acts and then the Pauline epistles leading up to the book of Revelation. We're going to begin our study in the pre-New Testament period, which is that 400 years of silence that took place from the time that Malachi, the last of the prophets, brought a close to the Old Testament, and the ministry of John the Baptist. It is that period of silence where there was no prophetic voice in Israel. Its more formal term or designation is the intertestamental period. Now today, New Testament scholars have redefined it, or they actually now look at that period of time as the Second Temple period. And this covers the period of time beginning in 515 BC with the rebuilding of Solomon's temple to AD 70, where it is destroyed by the Romans under Titus. There are 5 events that have impacted the Jews of the Second Temple period, and we'll look at these briefly. First of all was Nebuchadnezzar's invasion of Judah and the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of Solomon's first temple in 587, 586 BC. This took place because God had warned Israel that if she breaches the covenant that he made with her through Moses, which was a conditional covenant, that he would bring judgment upon the Jews. This is stated in Exodus 24, Leviticus 26, and Deuteronomy 28. Unlike the Abrahamic covenant, which was unconditional, meaning that Israel would always be God's people, the Jews would always be God's people, there would always be a covenant relationship between him and the Jews in place. And that's why we believe that Israel will be restored as a nation in the future, because the Abrahamic covenant has not been displaced. Unlike replacement theology, which teaches that the covenants have been transferred to the church, that is not the case. I think if you read the book of Romans, you'll see very clearly that the Apostle Paul did not at all consider the Jews to have been totally abandoned and rejected by God. And there's evidence in the book of Revelation also that the Jewish people are going to be, the Jewish remnant is going to be restored. And it is through that remnant that God is going to bring Israel back as a nation. So I think we could safely say the Abrahamic covenant, which was an unconditional covenant that God himself initiated and finalized, is in force and will ultimately be, we'll see the reestablishment of Israel as a nation. On the other hand, the covenant he made with Moses, the Mosaic covenant, this was a conditional covenant. And the condition was simply this: if Israel is obedient, God will bless her. If she's disobedient, she'll fall into judgment. And we know from reading the Old Testament record that Israel continually fell into idolatry, rebellion. With the death of Solomon, you find that the kingdom of Israel is divided into the northern and the southern kingdoms. They have wicked rulers, and eventually the Assyrians conquer Israel, and then ultimately the Babylonian Empire conquers that region and takes the Jews into captivity, and that's where we're at right now. Following the Babylonian occupation, the Babylonian exile, there's the destruction of the Babylonians by the Persians, and eventually the destruction of the Persian Empire by Alexander the Great and his domination of the Near East in 331 BC. Daniel chapter 8, verses 5 through 8 describes this political situation. It was also under Alexander, who I will add was tutored by the great philosopher Aristotle. Alexander appreciated and really loved Greek culture, and so the Hellenization of the culture in that region became a dominant influence. With the death of Alexander the Great, his kingdom was divided among four of his generals. The two most significant of the four included the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. So we have a Ptolemaic period and then a Seleucid or Syrian period. The Syrian period is of particular interest to us because it is through this group that Antiochus IV comes into power. He goes to Jerusalem, destroys the city, and or sacks the city, I should say, and then he commits a sacrilege. He slaughters a pig in the temple, which is known in Daniel as the abomination of desolation. And Antiochus IV is also a type of the Antichrist. So that's an important part of Jewish history and the events that impacted it. It was also because of this action by Antiochus IV that led to a revolt by Mattathias and his sons, which is commonly known as the Maccabean Revolt. The third major event that impacted the Jews during the Second Temple period was their independence. As a result of strong leadership and an aggressive and dedicated commitment to their own liberation, the Jewish revolt against Antiochus IV led to the establishment of an independent Jewish state that lasted from 141 to 63 BC. The fourth major event in the Second Temple period was the Roman occupation or defeat of the Jews and the conquering of Jerusalem in 63 BC by the Romans under Pompey. Judea came under Roman rule and was governed by a succession of difficult governors. It is this period of Roman rule that spills over into the New Testament period, witnessed by the birth, ministry, death, and resurrection of Christ, and the expansion of Christianity written about in the book of Acts. The Second Temple period comes to an end with the Jewish revolt against Rome, which led to its destruction, or to the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Now let's go back and take a look in more detail at the political landscape. We want to begin with the Babylonian exile. So if you have your Bibles, please get those, and we'll be looking at Daniel chapter 2 because this is an important chapter describing the very things we're going to be talking about concerning the political landscape. In Daniel chapter 2, this is where Nebuchadnezzar has his dream or his vision of the great image, and then he eventually calls on Daniel to give the interpretation, which Daniel does. So in 586 BC, Jerusalem fell to Nebuchadnezzar, and this inaugurated the Babylonian exile. And so beginning in verse 31 of chapter 2, during this exile, God gives Nebuchadnezzar a vision. He gives him essentially a panoramic view of the future, which was quite remarkable. In one respect, it was quite a privilege for Nebuchadnezzar to be given this tremendous revelation of what was yet to come in human history. And so Nebuchadnezzar, not able to find anyone in his kingdom among his magicians and advisors who could give an interpretation, we find that Daniel eventually is the one who is called upon to do so, and this is what we find in verse 31. He says, "Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before you, and the form of it was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet of clay, and its iron. Thou sawest until a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon its feet, that were of iron and clay, and broke into pieces. Then were the iron and the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold, broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth." The second advent of Christ, the conquering king, the Messiah, who comes back and establishes his kingdom. Now Daniel is going to give Nebuchadnezzar the interpretation in verse 36 through 38. It says, "This is the dream, and we will tell its interpretation before the king. Thou, king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And wherever the children of Israel or children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heavens hath he given into thy hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold." Now I want you to note something quite remarkable here. And this is remarkable given who Nebuchadnezzar was, a very powerful king, king of the most powerful nation on earth, a world power. Obviously, Nebuchadnezzar would think that he is the one that had the power and the ability to conquer. This would not be atypical of these pagan kings of that time. In fact, their ability to defeat other nations was credited to their gods. That's how kings and warfare was executed in the Old Testament. It wasn't necessarily a war between two nations and the kings themselves, even though they conducted the war, but it was actually a war between the gods. So whichever kingdom conquered, actually that kingdom recognized their victory as given to them by their god in defeating the pagan god or the god of the other nation. And so it would not be unusual for Nebuchadnezzar to think this way. But what Daniel is doing, and it's quite important, especially as you read the later chapters of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar's, how God deals with him, Nebuchadnezzar would no doubt look at his successes as something that he was able to do in and of himself and with the help of his false gods. But what Daniel is showing Nebuchadnezzar here, and what's instructive for us, is that God is demonstrating that he is the one who is sovereign over the nations. In fact, he's going to make it very clear to Nebuchadnezzar through Daniel, it is by my power, it is by my strength, and it is by my will that you have been able to do what you've been able to do. And in fact, in the event, Nebuchadnezzar, that you think otherwise, I'm going to let you know that your kingdom is not going to last. There's going to be another nation that's going to conquer you, and then another nation is going to conquer that nation. So God is showing him in a panoramic way that there's going to be the rise and the fall of powerful nations, and there's going to come one ultimately who will defeat all of them, and he alone will establish an everlasting kingdom, which Nebuchadnezzar, as we will see if you read through the next few chapters of Daniel up to Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar will arrive at this conclusion. He will come to the point where he will recognize that Yahweh is the one true God, and that Yahweh is the one who will rule universally. It's an absolutely remarkable unfolding of the spiritual enlightenment, if you will, of a pagan king of Nebuchadnezzar's stature. And I'm convinced, based on the things that he says before he passes from the scene, I'm convinced that Nebuchadnezzar did come to what we would call today a saving faith in Yahweh. And I believe Nebuchadnezzar is in heaven. I believe that he did finally submit and come under the authority of Yahweh. He finally acknowledged who Yahweh is, and he truly believed. I think that's a remarkable part of the book of Daniel, where we see God bringing this powerful king into a relationship with him. What's extraordinary about that is we find that Belshazzar, on the other hand, God tells him that his days are numbered. We don't see any evidence of Belshazzar's salvation. And as I was studying this section of Jewish history in the book of Daniel and some information on this, it's interesting because God gives Nebuchadnezzar the opportunity. Belshazzar, on the other hand, is a rebellious man who never comes to any acknowledgement of the one true God. Some believe it could be because when Nebuchadnezzar did conquer Jerusalem and he took the temple artifacts, the things that were in the temple, back to Babylon, he locked them up for safekeeping. There are different theories on why he did that. One is he wanted to protect them. Second of all, it could mean that he, in doing so, was demonstrating his power and authority over the God of Israel. On the other hand, when Belshazzar had his pagan idolatrous feast, he brought the temple dishes and other implements of that nature into that banquet and desecrated them. So there could be some kind of relationship between, or I should say, the relationship that existed between Nebuchadnezzar and his attitude toward the things of God versus that of Belshazzar could have had some bearing on God's dealings with these two men in their different ways. Now, you can take that for what it's worth. But anyway, I think the point here that I want to make is we see in the intertestamental period the remarkable unfolding of the prophecies that were given to Daniel centuries earlier, in particular to starting with Babylon, and the fact that a powerful Babylonian ruler finally was brought to his knees, and instead of rebelling, he submitted himself to the God of Israel. Now, following the Babylonian exile, we have what's called the Persian occupation, and this is where Babylon is eventually conquered about 50 years later by the Medo-Persians. And this takes place, actually, the Medo-Persian Empire extends not only through the end of the Old Testament period, but even a little bit beyond it. And at that time, the Persian Empire will be in control of both Judea and Jerusalem. Now, in 537 BC, Cyrus, the Persian ruler, he permits the Jews to return to Judea. And here they begin rebuilding Jerusalem. They also start the rebuilding of Solomon's temple, which would be the second temple, eventually inaugurating the second temple period, which would begin in 515 BC with the completion of the temple's construction. And it was also during this time that the prophets Haggai and Zechariah were prophesying. Daniel mentions this in verse 39, where it says, "And after thee," meaning after you, Nebuchadnezzar, in the kingdom of Babylon, there shall rise another kingdom inferior to you. And he says also another third kingdom of bronze, which shall bear rule over all the earth. So here, in verse 39, Daniel's talking about both the Medo-Persian Empire and the eventual collapse of that empire, which brings us now to the third, and that empire that conquers the Medes and the Persians is the or I should say, is the Greek occupation. The Grecian period begins in 334 when Alexander the Great defeats the Persians. Alexander was a remarkable military leader, and he was well educated, and he was cultured. As I mentioned earlier, he was tutored by the great philosopher Aristotle. Now, Alexander, there is no telling how far he could have gone and how much he could have achieved had he lived longer than what he did. He died in his early 30s, and at his death, his kingdom was divided up among four generals. And the book of Daniel talks about this in chapter 8, where he describes the broken horn, which is the death of Alexander, and then he describes four horns that come out of the broken horn, which these four horns would be the four generals who divide up the kingdom. The first general is Lysimachus. He takes the northern regions. Cassander takes the western. Seleucus is the eastern, takes over the eastern portion, which is Syria. And then Ptolemy acquires the southern region, which is Egypt. Now, of these four, the two most important of these rulers is Seleucus and Ptolemy. And these will have a strong bearing on Israel and lay the foundation actually for becoming of Rome and later moving into the New Testament. So let's take a look briefly at the Ptolemaic period. There was a vigorous rivalry between the Ptolemies and the Seleucidae. It was bitter, and it led to numerous wars and skirmishes. Eventually, under the Ptolemies, or Egypt annexed Palestine and ruled it for 122 years. But during this period of time, under that rulership of the Ptolemies, the Jews did enjoy a period of basic peace, or relative peace, and self-rule. With the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC, this did bring an end to the Ptolemaic rule. And at that time, Rome then annexed Egypt and made her a source of granaries, in other words, a food source for Rome. Alexandria, Egypt, also became a significant city, and it was known not only for its tremendous commerce, but its famous, magnificent library was located there that housed precious documents, manuscripts, and it was the center of education. The Jewish influence in Alexandria was very strong due to Alexander the Great's assigning of a place for the Jews to settle, and in doing so they received citizenship. It was also during this time that the translation of the Jewish Old Testament took place into the Greek language under Philadelphus, and this resulted in what is commonly known today as the Septuagint, or the letters LXX, or numbers actually. The second period is the Seleucid or Syrian period. At the end of the 122 years of Ptolemaic rule, the Seleucids were able to gain control of Palestine, and the Jews were now under the rule of Antiochus III. It was during this reign that the Hellenization of the regions controlled by the Seleucids began, or was escalated. This entailed imposing the Greek language and Greek customs on all the people that lived in that region, including the Jews. However, there was a small group of Jews known as the Hasidians who opposed the Hellenization program, and we'll see later that out of this group would be the Pharisees. Following Antiochus III came the wicked ruler who is mentioned in the book of Daniel, Antiochus IV. When he came into power, he attempted to continue a vigorous Hellenization of the region by introducing Greek culture and Greek customs, and no doubt Greek pagan thought. Jewish resistance to this Hellenization plan led to their persecution by Antiochus, so he goes to Jerusalem and sacks the city. And as an ongoing repudiation, if you will, of Jewish culture and Jewish religious practices, he desecrates the temple by sacrificing a pig on the great altar in the temple area. And this is described in Daniel chapter 8, verses 9 through 14. Let's turn there and read that section. Daniel chapter 8, verses 9 through 14. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it grew great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of the sanctuary was cast down. And an host was given to him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it continued and prospered. Then I heard one saint speaking to another saint, and another saint said unto that certain saint who spoke, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to get both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled under foot? And he said unto me, Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So with this action by Antiochus IV, this ridiculous desecration of the temple, that inaugurates what would become the period of Jewish independence, which had two segments to it, or two periods. First of all, the Maccabean period, and then the Hasmonean period. So let's take a look first of all at the Maccabean period. Again, we're only looking at this briefly. And I might add, if you ever get a chance, get a copy of the Apocrypha and read 1st and 2nd Maccabees, because those books in the Apocrypha are very important historical documents describing what went on during this period of time. So the Apocrypha does have tremendous value for our understanding of what was going on during the intertestamental period. So the Maccabean period. In response to the desecration of the temple, a revolt broke out. This revolt was led by Mattathias and his 5 sons, and it is known as the Maccabean Revolt. Eventually, Mattathias was killed, and his son Judas, nicknamed Maccabeus, or the Hammer, took over the struggle. Eventually, he was able to defeat the Syrians on 2 different occasions, and the forces of Antiochus IV were expelled from Jerusalem, and the temple was eventually cleansed. To celebrate the liberation of Jerusalem and the cleansing of the temple, a new feast was initiated, which is known as the Feast of Lights or the Feast of Dedication. Judas, however, was eventually killed in battle, and the fight for independence continued with his brother Jonathan. Another brother, Simon, befriended Demetrius II, who now was in political power in Syria over the Seleucid region. He gave Simon political freedom and released the Israelites or the Jews from all taxes forever. This brought about Judea's independence, and it brought an end to the Maccabean struggle. Now we find ourselves moving into the Hasmonean period. Simon, as we've already mentioned, then became the high priest, and he ruled very well, but his rule was brief. He did enter a treaty with Rome, and this was made in 139 BC, and as a result, Rome recognized the independence of the Jewish state, and this brought about a peace in the Jewish state, and it brought about a revival of Jewish religious life. However, by 135 BC, internal problems arose, and Simon, along with 2 sons, were murdered by Simon's son-in-law, Ptolemy. Now, his surviving son, John Hyrcanus, took Jerusalem before Ptolemy was able to secure it himself. And in the process, he then went after Ptolemy, who barricaded himself in his castle, and then eventually he was able to flee to Egypt. Now, in the political realm, Demetrius II lost power, and Antiochus VII gained power of Syria. And as a result of this, the friendly relationship that existed between the state of Israel and Syria came to an end, and the Jews or I should say Jerusalem was attacked eventually by Antiochus VII. This brings about Hyrcanus, who conquered Idumea, which is south of Jerusalem, that region south of Jerusalem, and Samaria, which is north of Jerusalem, as well as cities that were east of the Jordan River, of the Jordan area. Through him, the Hasmonean dynasty was established. Now this moves us into the Roman occupation, and this is referenced in Daniel chapter 7, verses 19 through 25. Following Hyrcanus' death, there continued to be instability and many conflicts throughout the region. This eventually led to the Roman occupation of Jerusalem by Pompey, thus beginning an end, or I should say bringing an end, to the Jewish independence and the control of Palestine by Rome in 63 BC. And now the Roman Empire gains tremendous strength, and it will now carry over into the New Testament period. I want to move now to a fourth category in our study of the cultural background to the New Testament, and that is the Jewish literature of the intertestamental or the Second Temple period. And we're not going to look at these again in great detail. I'll leave that up to you to do in your reading of the textbooks, as well as any other resources that you want to get a hold of to study this period of time, which would be well worth your effort because it is quite a fascinating period and it does have importance to our understanding of the things that developed and were active in the New Testament. So some of the literature that came out of the intertestamental period, the Second Temple period, include number one, the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha, these books were not included in the Hebrew Bible, but they were included in the Septuagint, which, as you recall, the Septuagint was translated in the intertestamental period, and it's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. Then we have what is called the Pseudepigrapha. This is literature that was written between 200 BC and AD 200. The genre of this literature includes apocalyptic material, testaments, hymns, and narrative fiction, among other things. The third is the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were, that stretches from around 140 BC to AD 68, but predominantly in the intertestamental period. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls are very, very important to the New Testament studies and the Old Testament as well. Here's some basic information on this remarkable material. It was produced by the Qumran community, which is located approximately 7 miles south of Jericho. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, and as an aside, if you read the Da Vinci Code, you'll note he makes a glaring historical error where in that book it's claimed that they were discovered in the 50s. But the scrolls were discovered in 1947 by Bedouin shepherds. Initially, what was discovered were 8 large clay jars dating from around the 1st century BC. Excavations were then conducted in more caves, and the more the caves that were explored revealed more scrolls. So there was a tremendous cache of manuscripts that were discovered. Now, the contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls included such things as the books of the Old Testament, with the exception of Esther, and that includes the famous Isaiah scroll, which is a very important scroll because it's the complete book of Isaiah. And this is very important, especially with respect to manuscript research, because until the discovery of the Qumran scrolls, the earliest manuscript of the Old Testament in possession was about 1,000 years removed from the period of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Qumran society that produced them. So what is remarkable about this discovery is that the manuscripts of the Old Testament that we have that were 1,000 years removed from the period of the intertestamental era, and the discovery of the pre-New Testament copies of the Old Testament revealed to scholars how absolutely profoundly accurate the copying process really was, which means you could take the scrolls of Qumran and the manuscripts that were dated 1,000 years later in age. You could take those manuscripts and you could see where they would pretty much you would have the same text. Now that doesn't mean that it was identical, but the point of it is it demonstrated that copyists were very, very diligent and careful in preserving the text of the Old Testament, the books of the Old Testament. Other documents that were included in the Qumran scrolls, the Qumran discovery, were the Manual of Discipline, the Damascus document, Thanksgiving hymn, and Order of Warfare, and there were many others, but just mention them.
What happened? Okay, why did they stop? Okay, I don't know why you just stopped. Ready? Just taking a break.
Judgment following
Go back.
or a destructive force and much debate of the Jews.
You want to go back.
In contact with them. But his writings are important because it gives us a good understanding of a Jewish philosopher of that period and his understanding not only of what Judaism taught, but also the philosophical elements as well. In his works, we find that he taught about creation, and in that book it's claimed that they were discovered in the 50s.
Okay.
But the scrolls were discovered in 1947 by Bedouin shepherds. Initially, what was discovered were 8 large clay jars dating from around the 1st century BC. Excavations were then conducted in more caves, and the more the caves that were explored revealed more scrolls. So there was a tremendous cache of manuscripts that were discovered. Now, the contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls included such things as the books of the Old Testament, with the exception of Esther, and that includes the famous Isaiah scroll, which is a very important scroll because it's the complete book of Isaiah. And this is very important, especially with respect to manuscript research, because until the discovery of the Qumran scrolls, the earliest manuscript of the Old Testament in possession was about 1,000 years removed from the period of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Qumran Society that produced them. So what is remarkable about this discovery is that the manuscripts of the Old Testament that we have that were 1,000 years removed from the period of the intertestamental era, and the discovery of the pre-New Testament copies of the Old Testament revealed to scholars how absolutely profoundly accurate the copying process really was, which means you could take the scrolls of Qumran and the manuscripts that were dated 1,000 years later in age. You could take those manuscripts and you could see where they would pretty much you would have the same text. Now that doesn't mean that it was identical, but the point of it is it demonstrated that copyists were very, very diligent and careful in preserving the text of the Old Testament, the books of the Old Testament. Other documents that were included in the Qumran scrolls, the Qumran discovery, were the Manual of Discipline, the Damascus document, Thanksgiving hymn, and Order of Warfare, and there were many others, but just mention those. Those particular documents, among others, provided a glimpse into the rules, the tenets, the standards that were used to regulate the behavior within the Qumran community. Another source of Jewish literature is Philo of Alexandria. He lived from around 20 BC to 80 50. He would be a contemporary of the Apostle Paul. He wrote commentaries on the Bible as well as philosophical works. He was a Hellenistic Jew, and his work reflects the appropriation of Hellenistic or Greek thinking by a Jewish intellectual. He was, as I mentioned, a contemporary of Christ, Paul, and most of the apostles. I've not read anything where he knew these individuals or had contact with them. But his writings are important because it gives us a good understanding of a Jewish philosopher of that period and his understanding not only of what Judaism taught, but also the philosophical elements as well. In his works, we find that he taught about creation and evil. He affirms the creation by being brought about by a self-existent, all-powerful, omniscient, good God. As far as concerning circumcision, he taught that it was a symbolic ritual. It has to do with cutting off of the pleasures that corrupt the mind. So he had an allegorical understanding of circumcision. Concerning the Logos, he says it's an aspect of God's being that seemingly takes on a distinct personality. Philo also says the Logos is so close to God that the two are virtually indistinguishable, and the Logos was the primary agent in creation. However, Philo was not Trinitarian, but describing an aspect of God. So he has some interesting things to say, even though he was not Trinitarian in his understanding of the Godhead. As far as his use or interpretation of the Old Testament, he used what's called the allegorical approach. His allegorical method was quite influential, and this method of interpretation was dominant in the early church up through the Middle Ages. However, by the time of the Reformation and the Enlightenment, it came under a tremendous challenge. The fifth major source of Jewish literature, and considerably important in our study of the New Testament as far as New Testament culture, is Josephus. Josephus was a Jew who, however, was, some would say, heavily involved and friendly toward the Romans, which didn't set well with the Jews. He was a Jewish historian who wrote for pretty much an educated Roman audience. Two of his famous works are The Jewish Wars, which begins with Alexander the Great and continues through the Jewish struggle with Rome. His work Antiquities traces the history of the Jews as described in the Hebrew Bible. Now I want us to move into what we call Jewish sects. And we're going to look at these religious groups that arose during the intertestamental period and then carried over into the New Testament. And of course, the two most important are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So let's begin with the Pharisees. Concerning their origin, one scholar says the circumstances surrounding the origin of the Pharisees is lost to history. Another source, however, places their origin as a separate group around 135 BC. That would be around that period of time where there was a Jewish rebellion against the attempted Hellenization of the Jews. And the Hasidians would be considered, the Pharisees would be part of that group. The Hasmonean era, which was 150 BC, here the majority of scholars hold to that point of origin, which would be around the time of the Pharisees. The descendants of the Hasidim, they are considered descendants of the Hasidim who fought with the Maccabees against the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, who sought to Hellenize the Jews. The meaning of their name, Pharisee, itself has been much debated. It comes from a Hebrew term, perusim, and the root meaning simply means separation, consecration, secession, In other words, the separated ones is probably the best way to understand it. According to Josephus' work, The Jewish Wars, Josephus claims the Pharisees were a destructive force under the Hasmonean queen Alexandra and Herod. Eminent Pharisees opposed the war with Rome, which eventually led to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Also, the Pharisees were the most influential of the Jewish parties, according to Josephus' Antiquities. They were precise interpreters of the law, and they valued greatly the oral law, which Jesus would identify as the traditions of the fathers. In the New Testament, we find extensive references to the Pharisees, and we're given an insight into their behavior and the tumultuous relationship they had with the Lord. In Matthew chapter 5:20, Jesus condemns them as misguided righteousness. Or I should say, he condemns their misguided righteousness. In Matthew 23, he levels against them most vigorous and condemning series of statements to be found in all the Gospels, where he identifies them as hypocrites. In Matthew 3:6, he says that they are in league with the devil. Concerning the traditions of the Pharisees, he mentions their aggressive adherence to legal requirements such as eating laws or washings and cleansings. And then he condemns them for their committing to give money to religious purposes in order to bring themselves, if you will, glory. And in doing so, they neglect taking care of their parents. So they violate really the fifth table of the Old Testament law. Thou shalt honor your parents, your father and your mother. And Jesus points out that they were not doing that. On the other hand, Jesus did have positive encounters with them. He eats with the Pharisees. We find that in Luke chapter 7, verses 36 through 50, as well as Luke 11, 37 and 54, and Luke 14, 1 through 24. The Pharisees, there's a certain segment of the Pharisaical community that evidently had a positive outlook toward Christ, a favorable view of him. And these Pharisees warned Jesus of Herod's plot to kill him in Luke 13:31. And then we have miscellaneous conflicts that Luke records in chapter 5, verse 21, and verses 30 through 35, as well as chapter 6, verses 1 through 11. They were identified as self-righteous in Luke 18, 9 through 14. They questioned Jesus' authority in Luke chapter 5. John chapter 3 gives us a brief description of a famous Pharisee named Nicodemus, who comes to Jesus at night and talks to him about what must he do to be saved, to be born again. Then there are those Pharisees who collaborate with the authorities against Christ. John chapter 3, John 7, John 11, and John chapter 12. In the book of Acts, chapter 5, verses 33 through 39, and chapter 23, verse 9, and chapter 15, verse 5, we see where some Pharisees were what some might call as a somewhat sympathetic posture toward Christianity. And then probably the most famous Pharisee in all the New Testament is the Apostle Paul. We read about his actions in Philippians chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, and his discussion of his life in Acts chapter 23, verses 1 through 10. Now, what did the Pharisees believe? Of all the Jewish groups, religious groups, the Pharisees would come the closest to the basic theological ideas of Christianity. I guess, loosely speaking, if they were alive today, they would be compatible to a certain extent with evangelical theology. Here are some of the beliefs of the Pharisees. They believed in the resurrection or life after death, and they believed in rewards and punishments to follow. They believed in judgment, following death. They also held to the view of foreordination, which they considered compatible with the free will of man. They believed and used the whole Old Testament and the oral law. Now, concerning the oral law, which is known as the Mishnah, the oral law was handed down from the fathers, and it was considered equal in authority with the Torah. Oral law was a detailed description of how to keep the written law. In order to avoid breaking the 613 laws of the Torah, the Pharisees established hedges around those laws, which is oral tradition, in order to avoid intentional or accidental violations. And this is where we see the conflict really escalates between Jesus and the Pharisees. The Pharisees put so much emphasis on their oral traditions that, as Jesus put it, they absolutely missed it when it came to what the Old Testament was actually teaching. You see this in John chapter 3, when Jesus is engaging Nicodemus in a very interesting discussion concerning what he must do to be born again. And Jesus talks about salvation there. And what's remarkable is in verse 10, Jesus turns to Nicodemus and he says, "You being a teacher of the law, a man of no doubt scribal capabilities, an expert in the law, and you don't know these things." So what Jesus essentially was doing was he was reprimanding, I think gently, but he was nevertheless reprimanding Nicodemus for his lack of understanding of the very things that he should have understood. But I think it would be fair to say that Nicodemus was so enmeshed, if you will, in the traditions of the fathers, in those oral traditions that were used to hedge in the Old Testament, that Nicodemus totally missed the whole concept of what we know as the New Covenant spoken of in Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And I believe this is where Jesus was calling him into question and saying, you should know these things. You should know about this because it was spoken of in the Old Testament. And in other words, I think Jesus is saying to Nicodemus, you should be familiar with the New Covenant and understand its ramifications for salvation and reconciliation with God. But, of course, Nicodemus didn't understand that. And I think Nicodemus is a good example of what happens when religion and not true biblical faith gets in the way. People can be very religious. They can go through all the motions of religion, but they can be very active in doing religious things, but never have a true born-again, reconciled relationship with God through Jesus Christ, and it's a tragedy. In fact, that's where Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7, there will be some that will come to him at the judgment and say, Lord, Lord, have we not cast out demons and done all these other things in your name? He's going to say to them, I never knew you. I think the Pharisees would be a classic example of this. They did everything that they thought was right religiously, but when it came to their relationship to the Messiah and the New Covenant, they totally missed it. Totally missed it. That's also indicative in the account of the rich young ruler who comes to Christ and wants to know what he must do to be born again. He makes it clear that he's kept the law, he's kept the commandments, but still, he had no concept of the New Covenant. So again, we have a man who was very religious and yet totally, totally lost, which again is a most unfortunate state of affairs. Concerning the law, at the heart of Pharisaism is conformity to the law, in particular the traditions of the elders, which results in receiving God's grace for those who follow it. So it was definitely a works righteousness that the Pharisees embraced. They also held to the belief in the immortality of the soul. The doctrine of the immortality of the soul became a cornerstone of Pharisaism. They were monotheists. They were not Trinitarians, but they were monotheists. They believed in the existence of angels and demons. And they also held to a combination of free choice and divine control in human life. As for their social activities, they would be considered, I guess you could say, middle class. They used the synagogue for teaching. This institution was dominated by the Pharisees, and it served as a community center. And they also supported the temple. They tended to be evangelistic, which Jesus makes reference to that in Matthew 23. In the Jerusalem Talmud, that document, or that extensive collection of Jewish writings, describes 7 different types of Pharisees. 5 are considered hypocritical, 2 were good. You can also get a good description of the Pharisees in William Barclay's little commentary on Luke. So these subgroups, let me give you these. The subgroups of the Pharisees, the first one is called the shoulder or Shechemite Pharisee. This type of Pharisee was one who wore his good deeds on his shoulder on display for all men to see. Jesus opens his primary criticism of Pharisees in Matthew with the mention of the shoulder, possibly a reference to this commonly labeled type of Pharisee. They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them, Matthew 23:4. Then there's the wait a little Pharisee. This type of Pharisee would want to wait to see how a situation played out before acting on any matter. While he agreed with Pharisaical theology, he would always fall short in practice of his belief because he wasn't sure if he should, could, or wanted to act. This type of Pharisee liked the prestige brought about by being a religious leader, but didn't like what it actually required. Everything they do is for men to see. They make their phylacteries wide and their tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted in the marketplaces and to have men call them rabbi, Matthew 23:5-7. Then there's the blind or the bruised and bleeding Pharisee. This type of Pharisee was typified by the idea of him walking with his head down and turned away to avoid looking at or bumping into women or other unclean folks. So because they weren't looking where they were going, they would end up bruised or bleeding from their avoidance of small things. All the while forgetting the more important laws, Jesus refers to some Pharisees as blind guides, possibly referring to this type of Pharisee. There's the pestle or humpback Pharisee. Similar to the blind Pharisee, this Pharisee is known for walking around with his eyes averted for the purpose of avoiding visions that might be temptations. Avoiding temptation is one thing, but this type of Pharisee's heart was wrong because it was the importance of making a show of his avoidance of temptation which was to be criticized. He says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead men's bones and everything unclean." This is mentioned in Matthew 23:27. They have a reckoning Pharisee. Here was a religious person who was always keeping score, having to make sure that his good deeds always outnumbered his bad. In Matthew 23:29, Jesus says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites, you blind, or you build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the sin of your forefathers." A God-fearing or timid Pharisee, he was considered to be a God-fearer in the manner of Job. While he had great reverence and respect for God, it was out of fear of punishment. Unlike the previous types of Pharisees, both his belief and practice were correct, but his motivation was out of fear of God. It is possible that Jesus expressed woe in Matthew 23:13 by directing at this spirit of fear that then prevents others from enjoying the eternal life provided by God. And then the God-loving Pharisee. This type of Pharisee was considered to be the ideal, a person who obeyed God out of true love and affection for him, as in the manner of Abraham. The minority of Pharisees were believed to have been of this type, though Pharisees from the school of Hillel may have comprised a majority of this type of Pharisee. Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, and Paul were all Pharisees who would have fit into this category. Now, there's a conclusion that I think is very, very important to keep in mind, and Bruce Metzger makes an interesting observation. And I think he's right. He says it must not be supposed that all Pharisees were nothing but hypocrites. At first, when it was dangerous to be an opponent of Hellenism, the Pharisees were men of strong religious character. Subsequently, Pharisaism became an inherited belief, the profession of which was popular, and men of less heroic mold joined its ranks. Jesus' scathing rebukes are sometimes assumed to mean one to the party of the Pharisees, none of whom are any good. In the light of all the evidence, however, it appears that Jesus' woes are to be understood as directed against those kinds of Pharisees who were unworthy of the heritage of the Hasidians. According to the Gospels, Jesus was on friendly terms with some of the Pharisees, such as Simon, who made a banquet for him in Luke 7:37. On another occasion, certain Pharisees warned him that Herod was seeking his life, Luke 13:31. Other Pharisees, however, whose religious formalism and hypocrisy Jesus had denounced so vigorously, took a prominent part in plotting his death. See that in Mark 3:6 and John 11:47-57. Now let's move to the Sadducees. This group arose during the Maccabean period. They claim their name comes from the sons of Zakok, high priest, in the days of David and Solomon. They disappeared around the first 2 centuries AD. Some contend that the Sadducees declined following the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. They were the chief opponents of the Pharisees. Little is known about the Sadducees, however, compared to the Pharisees. They represent one of the 3 varieties of Judaism that existed during the Maccabean period. Unlike the Pharisees, the Sadducees did not have the support of the masses of the people. They were well received, however, by the wealthy, and they were very political. They represented the sophisticated urban class in Jerusalem. Now, concerning their beliefs, you'll really get some insights here when you see what they believed. They would be, by today's standards, the liberals, the theological liberals, and the unregenerate. They were rationalists. They rejected the concept of fate. They embraced free will. The reason for emphasis on free will was to avoid the problem of God being responsible for the problem of evil. They did not believe the soul continued to exist after death. They rejected the idea of rewards and punishments. They observed nothing apart from the law. They rejected the oral traditions espoused by the Pharisees and recorded in the Mishnah. The Sadducees embraced the Torah, and that was the extent of their use of the Old Testament for the most part. They rejected the resurrection, and they denied the existence of angels and spirits. It is suggested that the rejection of these doctrines has to do with the fact that they were not found in the written law in the Torah. New Testament information on the Sadducees in Matthew 3:7. When John the Baptist saw the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to him at the baptism, he calls them a brood of vipers. The New Testament in Luke 20:27 tells us some of the Sadducees who said there was no resurrection came to Jesus and started questioning him. In Acts 23, Paul, knowing what the Pharisees believed compared to the Sadducees, raises the question of the resurrection, which then creates a debate and conflict between the 2 schools. The Essenes is another group. It's this group that is believed to have been what made up the Qumran community and the Dead Sea Scrolls, the producers of that material. They are one of 3 sects of Judaism, along with Pharisaism and Sadduceanism. They moved out of Jerusalem and lived a monastic life in the desert. They were particularly interesting to scholars because they are believed to be an offshoot of the group that lived in Qumran near the Dead Sea. There has been a debate as to whether or not John the Baptist was an Essene or had connections with the Essene community. No solid evidence exists. In fact, some of the reading I've done, the scholars I've read tend to not believe that John had any relationship with them. As far as their beliefs are concerned, they worship one God, creator and ruler of all things, who is omnipotent and omniscient. Moses was held in high esteem. The Son was held in such reverence as to awaken suspicion of idolatry. and on all disposing faith was admitted, yet free will apparently was not denied. They refused to join in the temple sacrifices through fear of pollution, though they sent guests to it. No blood sacrifices offered by them, and they claimed that a reverent mind was the best offering to God. They observed the Sabbath with the most rigorous exactitude, as some say, not even the calls of nature being answered. That could be interesting. They washed frequently, and no doubt they needed to if they weren't answering the call of nature during the Sabbath. And it was extremely important as an act of ceremonial purity. They welcomed death as they held that their bodies were corruptible and the matter composing them was not lasting, but the souls are immortal. So you see there kind of a dualism. I wouldn't say it's a Platonic dualism as taught by the philosopher Plato, but there seems to be an incipient dualism there. They were virtuous and practiced obedience, truthfulness, countenance, justice, and temperance, hospitality. All men were regarded equal. Slavery was regarded as contrary to nature. And then there's the Zealots. The Zealots. They were founded by Judas the Galilean, who incited a rebellion in AD 6, and that was crushed by Rome. They opposed payment of tribute to Rome. They agreed with the Pharisees on theological matters, and they were active in the rebellion against Rome from AD 66 to AD 70, leading to the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. In fact, in Acts 21:28, Paul is questioned, 21:38, Paul is questioned as to whether or not he was involved in the rebellion. The last great stronghold for them was Masada. And Jesus, interestingly enough, had a zealot in his group, Luke 6:15 and Acts 1:13. A minor group, but we don't see much of in the New Testament, are the Herodians. No real definitive agreement on the origin of this group. They were sympathetic to the rule of Herod in Rome, so evidently they had political, they were politically motivated, and they were in opposition to Jesus, Mark 3:6, Matthew 22:16, and Mark 12:13. Then you have the scribes and the lawyers. Scribes and the lawyers. These were the professional interpreters of the Old Testament. They were experts in the Mosaic Law. They were also called teachers of the law. And they demanded absolute reverence from their students. They were referred to as rabbi. Most of them belonged to the party of the Pharisees. And they were oppressive, and they were the promoters and teachers of the oppressive traditions of the elders. So the traditions of the elders and the strict adherence to those traditions would be the work of the scribes, Matthew 15:2 and Mark 7:3 and 5. That concludes this lecture. We will pick up in the next lecture and continue with our study of the cultural context of the New Testament. And we'll begin our next lecture by looking at the institutions of that period of time. We'll look at philosophical schools, and then we're going to take a look at the Herodian dynasty and those important individuals that were part of it and their place in the New Testament.
Okay. Hopefully you learned something on this study that we just did on the New Testament background and lecture number 5. Hope you learned something, and may the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord watch over you and protect you. Don't forget to like this page, share this page, and subscribe to our page for when we start doing the next video. This is in Tux. Okay? Peace be unto you. Shalom.